Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the Ritualist Comprehensive Guide. This is going to be a two-part video series specifically on the Ritualist. I'm going to be starting with an overall view of the Ritualist and then get into some broad general items that are useful for Ritualists and most classes in general actually, and then I will discuss 3 of the 8 endgame builds in this part. Part 2 will cover the remaining 5 builds, the remaining 5 legendary sets. So with that, let's get started right off the top. And I want to talk about right away one of the, well, actually the 2 most important skills that the Ritualist will have access to, and these are 2 skills that no matter how you're building, you should at least consider using. The first is Devouring Swarm. Now, regardless of whether or not you're building hybrid pets, full pets, Stormcaller's Pact, or Harbinger of Souls, Devouring Swarm offers you excellent resistance reduction, a little bit of attack damage conversion to health, which, granted, with the small amounts of damage it does, that doesn't really make a huge difference. But consider it reduces both vitality and bleeding resistance. So, even if you were going, let's say you were going into Stormcaller's Pact, you have access to Primal Strike. There's bleeding damage here. And then you are hitting more enemies with Torment, who will want their bleeding resistance reduced, and then you have more bleeding damage here. You have Brute Force, right? Physical and internal trauma, no problem. Oh, look, bleeding. Oh, look, bleeding. And the same thing with Savagery. Lightning and bleeding, increases in stats, lightning, but we do have bleeding here. Over here, we have physical bleeding, a little bit of vitality. Okay? Over here at Blood Pact, bleeding. Pretty much everything the Shaman has access to, with the sole exception of the Wind Devils, causes bleed. The Briarthorn doesn't either. That's a different story. And of course, Mogdragon's Pact is a self-buff, so it doesn't actually do damage. But even the Primal Spirit, should you want to use this, does bleeding damage. So, no matter how you approach this, you're going to be involved with bleeding, whether you use Stormcaller's Pact or the more obviously bleeding-causing Primal Bond. But even with Necromancer, you're using the Vitality Resistance. I'll talk about these 2 in a second. You're using the Vitality Resistance because Drain Essence, we have Vitality, right, all across the board. That's a lot of Vitality. And then you have Vitality here. You've got Vitality here. You've got Vitality here. Your skeletons do vitality damage. Your Blight Fiend, I think he gets some, he gets vitality damage under Blight Burst, right? If you use Harbinger of Souls, vitality damage. You use Siphon Souls, vitality and some bleeding with Blood Boil. So, also, by the way, finally, to finish off, I believe Ravenous Earth does, Ravenous Earth does vitality as well. I was going to say bleeding, but I knew that was wrong. It's on a bleeding tangent, I'm sorry. Anyways, you've also got Vitality in Reaping Strike and Vitality in Necrotic Edge. So no matter what skills you use with the Ritualist, Devouring Swarm will reduce your enemy's resistance to that, and by quite a lot. This is primarily used, actually this is almost exclusively used, for its resistance reduction. There is obviously a greater emphasis on the Vitality resistance drop, but bleeding still will really help you here. And it's not like you can't smoothly incorporate some vitality into your build here anyways. Additionally, the second point of interest is Spectral Binding, but specifically Spectral Wrath, and this is actually the reason why I tend to play a melee Ritualist a lot of the time. This is one of 2 reasons. But you have a physical resistance drop, and as we just discussed previously with the Shaman, most of these abilities deal physical damage. In fact, the only ones that don't directly deal physical damage are Devouring Swarm and the Wendigo Totem, and of course Storm Totem, which is also the only thing the Shaman has that doesn't do bleed, by the way. I forgot to mention that. But you have incredibly large amounts of physical damage across all of these other skills. And of course you have the Vitality and Aether damage that you're doing, which helps Harbinger of Souls, as well as, again, all the rest of these skills present here. So these 2 particular skills are always always at least worth some consideration, regardless of how you're building. You don't necessarily have to build them, but if you have some spare points or you don't know what to build, these are never a mistake, at least with the Ritualist. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and pull out these points. I will leave 1 point in each as a reminder that yes, these are incredibly potent for this combination, regardless of how you run. But let's talk about Harbinger of Souls, because this is my favorite way of approaching a single-player Ritualist. I'll explain why when I get to the pets, why I use pets more for multiplayer. But with the Harbinger of Souls, you have an answer to most enemies in the game, because you see, enemies fall into different factions, and the two biggest factions are the Chthonics, who resist vitality damage but don't usually resist aether damage, and the Ethereals, who do resist aether damage pretty well but don't usually resist vitality damage. Now, each side does have heroes that will resist the normally weak damage type, which is fine. That's why we have vitality resistance drops all over the place here. But you will have an effective damage response no matter what enemy comes roaring your way. Again, borrowing specific heroes for the Chthonics and the Ethereals. So with the Harbinger of Souls, of course, you have pretty much everything here as an option. It pretty much goes without saying. Ravenous Earth is incredibly potent. You've got Siphon Souls. Had you on there, pardon me. You have Drain Essence. Of course, you've got Bone Harvest as well. But what about the Shaman? Well, obviously, you of course have Devouring Swarm. You've got Grasping Vines, which does bleeding damage. Additionally, it does some vitality damage. You've got Wendigo Totem for vitality damage, bleeding damage on Blood Pact, increase vitality damage. And you can also go into Storm Totem, convert it into the Corrupted Storm, and then do vitality damage through that as well. So you've got some great options with the Harbinger of Souls. Now, personally, when I am looking to run a Harbinger of Souls in a solo scenario, I'll usually run, first off, I'll usually run melee, as I've stated before. Go into Spectral Binding, I'll usually go into Spectral Wrath. Usually I'll do a nice tasty Siphon Souls, get a Blood Boil in there, and then I will usually, well, we don't need all points here. Go into Wendigo Totem and Blood Pact, Grasping Vines, Entangling Vines, ooh, good old Devouring Swarm, and it depends on whether or not you want Drain Essence. At this particular point, you could go into Reaping Strike and Necrotic Edge and have a fairly interesting time there. If you really wanted to, you could go into Primal Strike if you're using a two-handed weapon and chain stun enemies as your Vines, your Wendigo Totem, and your Siphon Souls are all draining them out to death, which is fairly interesting. You could put some points into Reap Spirit, which is generally pretty awesome if you're using either of the exclusive skills of the Necromancer, because even if you're not building pets, the Reap Spirit activation does Aether and Vitality damage anyways, and it does pretty impressive amounts of Aether and Vitality damage, so the Wraith at that point is just a freebie. It doesn't, even if you're not building for pets, even if you're not looking to go hybrid, this is still very useful under Harbinger of Souls, so it's worth consideration. You also don't necessarily need Siphon Souls. In fact, if I have to scratch an ability, this is the first thing that goes, because I can get plenty of healing out of Wendigo Totem, and you'll notice that I recommend Wendigo Totem a lot over a lot of the other self-heals of the Ritualist, and the primary reason why is because Mend Wounds down there is not dependent on the damage it's doing to the enemy, right? Which is something of a problem with the rest of the healing here. This is only converting 10% of your attack damage. I mean, later on down the road, you get more attack damage converted to health. That's fine, but this is only draining a percentage of the damage it's actually dealing. So if an enemy is resistant to it, especially in the early game where you're not necessarily set up, this is often not going to heal you enough, and neither is Siphon Souls. So in this particular instance, I am much more likely to go into and keep Wendigo Totem for its healing than either Siphon Souls or Drain Essence. So that is something that I feel is very important to highlight with the Ritualist, is that the Wendigo Totem is a more consistent healing experience than the rest of the skills available to you. So you do have that. Again, even if you're going with Harbinger of Souls, don't be afraid of necessarily going into Primal Strike or Savagery. That's perfectly acceptable. Actually, let's leave this up for a hot second, because we can talk about something a little bit differently. Now, you don't really have any need to do this, because, again, you are going to have most of your potential issues with resistant enemies solved, but you absolutely could go into Savagery if you wanted a full attack speed build. Go into Tenacity of the Boar. Again, I usually recommend melee. If you go two-handed melee, you can do even more damage, and then you can very easily go into Necrotic Edge, and then you can go into Brute Force, Feral Hunger. Of course, if you really want more Feral Hunger, you can pull this out here. You can go into here. Or if you really want to go a little bit aggressive and heavy on the auto attacking, you can finish this out. Go ahead and bust that out, pull one point out here, and go fully into Necrotic Edge, and just use the Wendigo Totem's Mend Wound parts, and not even have to worry about Blood Pact. And of course, if you are pretty nervous about surviving still, you can pull out some points here, and you can go into Primal Strike if you really wanted to. You could drop Necrotic Edge and get Primal Strike. You have a lot of different options here. But you do have that, and really the lightning damage, the physical damage, etc. will just act as a sort of bonus damage through the savagery, of course. So you can absolutely 100% go in that direction. That is perfectly acceptable. That's actually great. I have done that a couple of times. It works out quite well a lot of the time. Yeah, fantastic experience. By the way, the combination of Feral Hunger plus Reaping Strike may be enough to sustain you even without Wendigo Totem, and you can also utilize that to your advantage as well. Now, we have, of course, the... I don't need all the points in you. Ooh. You, of course, also have the Stormcaller's Pact. Right? Now, the Stormcaller's Pact is fairly interesting because of a couple of reasons. Alright? Actually, we probably should keep the max here. Now, Stormcaller's Pact is a fascinating time because you can, well, first off, obviously go into Savagery, Primal Strike, Brute Force, all of which do lightning damage, Storm Totem, of course, but you can also do a couple of very interesting things with the Necromancer. Again, this really helps if you happen to be a two-handed melee weapon wielder, because you can actually go into good old Bone Harvest here, which does cold damage, which Stormcaller's Pact increases, more cold damage out of Dread, and even more cold damage out of Soul Harvest. You're using a two-handed melee weapon, you can grab Harvester of Death, do even more cold damage. Yes, it reduces the range of this, but for a 20% increase in your damage and converting all of your physical damage to cold damage, which again is being boosted by Stormcaller's Pact, you can do some quite impressive things. And if you were going with the full lightning and cold, you don't even necessarily need Devouring Swarm. You can go into Wind Devil, right? Or you may not even want Spectral Wrath and Spectral Binding in this case. Between the two of these, well, between the three of these, I'd rather have Devouring Swarm because you are still doing a lot of bleeding damage, but you can go Wind Devil to reduce enemy elemental resistance, which will help your lightning and your cold damage. They themselves will do some lightning damage. Now, Maelstrom is not necessarily something I would consider necessary for the Wind Devils to be very effective. I'm often content just going Raging Tempest for that delicious elemental resistance drop, but you don't necessarily need Maelstrom. That's just going to give them the ability to do a little bit of damage, and it's just damage. It's not like they stun them or anything, so Maelstrom is very optional when it comes to the Wind Devils, but you do have all of these fantastic options as well. Now, I often don't also go into the Storm Totem, although there is something interesting you should know about the Storm Totem, which is that it never misses. At least the last time I checked. This is never going to miss, it doesn't care, it always hits. I just really don't use them that often because I'm too busy attacking with other things. For example, in this particular setup, you'd be using a heavy amount of savagery. You could also go, by the way, go into Necrotic Edge for some extra cold damage, by the way. Splash a little bit of vitality damage in there, no problemo. And you can absolutely run a very effective build here through this. So you do have all of those fairly interesting options. Now, when we're talking about pets, this is the reason why, right here, Emboldening Presence, this is the reason why I primarily use pets in multiplayer. Because if I'm not playing melee, then my Briarthorn can still use the Emboldening Presence to boost both my other pets, should I have any, and my allies that happen to be frontline as well. So this becomes quite significant, especially with allies, and of course the more allies you have, the more likely this will be significant, and I will often double down and run Mogdragon's Pact for similar reasons, boosting the physical damage, the health regeneration, and etc. All the rest of this, helping out you and your allies. But if you want to go with a hybrid build, I would recommend Primal Bond, and then what specific pets you go with from there is really up to you. But Primal Bond, of course, being a hybrid, really opens you up to quite the interesting idea, which is the summon Briarthorn, go with Primal Strike, max that out, and then go to the Necromancer, which we actually don't need all 10 points here. Go into Skeletons, right? And you can have an absolute field day, because you can pretty much practically chain stun most enemies. Assuming an enemy isn't resistant to stuns or immune to stuns, you can stun them for 2.6 to 4 seconds. Now, it only takes 3 seconds for Primal Strike to recharge, so the minimum amount of time an enemy will have to generally attack you is 0.4 seconds. Now, a lot of nemesis and bosses are either resistant or immune to stuns. Mostly, almost all of them are just resistant. So they'll probably snap out of the stun a little bit faster than Primal Strike will come back online, but that's not really a huge problem. And you can combine, your dozens of skeletons, or a Blight Fiend, what was that accent? Or a Blight Fiend if you really want. Totally up to you. But there is that as well, okay? So you do have that very interesting... Other than pets, for a Primal Bond build, you really don't necessarily build a whole lot more. Again, it's always worth considering Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath, and there is some potential with Siphon Souls, specifically the Blood Boil, which does bleeding damage, which Primal Bond is boosting, and you get to incorporate some nifty little vitality damage as well if you have not done so through other means. For example, the Wendigo Totem, which is frankly better a heal than Siphon Souls is going to be. In most cases, unless you're absolutely surrounded by an absolutely massive swarm of enemies and you drain them all at the same time, the Wendigo Totem is going to be better. But you do have all of these excellent options. And then, of course, really, if you want to go full pet, you just go into Master of Death instead, and just absolutely load up on Skeletons and Blight Fiends, right? Just absolutely go ballistic here on these bad boys, things of that nature. And of course, if you are building, whether or not you're going full pets or partial pets, it's always worthwhile looking into Bone Harvest, which boosts your pets at the end with some extra vitality damage and damage in general. Or you could also use Call of the Grave, which boosts yourself and your pets. Now with the Ritualist, I don't often use Call of the Grave, even if I have pets, because the only poison acid ability you have is Ravenous Earth, and I'm not necessarily looking to use that. It really depends on the build. But that is overall where we typically go with Ritualists. Now for Constellations, there are a couple very specific constellations that you should really be aware of. First off, you should be aware of the Veil Warden. This is the second reason why I'm really fond of Harbinger of Souls Ritualists, okay? because his final skill here, the Will of Ratosh, has vitality resistance built right stinking into it, which means a endgame constellation, as they're called, is reducing the enemy's vitality resistance for you on top of the potential resistance reduction you are getting out of the Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath, and also the Devouring Swarm. So that's a lot of potential vitality resistance drop you have access to. Other constellations of particular note are, of course, the Huntress with Rend, which specifically reduces enemy bleed resistance, because there's, as you've probably noticed, a lot of bleed going on here. If you're going Stormcaller's Pact, obviously Ultos Shepherd of the Storms is extremely good, especially since the Hand of Ultos reduces enemies' elemental resistances by 20%, which is fairly impressive. This is every time you get a critical attack, so just keep your offensive ability up and you're pretty much golden. But of course, if you are going with Stormcaller's Pact, you are going with Ultos a lot of the time. Now, when I'm building hybrid with Primal Bond, I'm usually going to go into Mogdragon the Wolf. Now, not a lot of people necessarily realize that Mogdragon here is, in fact, a, quote, last or end game guardian, or whatever you want to define it as. But if I'm going to be building a Primal Bond hybrid pet personal, I'm going to go for Mogdragon, because she provides a lot of excellent bleeding damage increases, some bonuses for your pets, and then at the end you have the Howl of Mogdragon, which is going to boost your damage and boost your pets' damage as well. And of course, if you can combine that with Rend from the Huntress, that's pretty good business as well. Other things you should probably note, at least in terms of the Ritualist, is the Assassin's Blade, specifically the Assassin's Mark. Now, this is fairly important because a lot of, I think almost all of the bosses and the nemesis have like a 15% drop in the amount of physical damage they take. So the Assassin's Mark becomes extremely important to make sure you're actually doing your full levels of physical damage. If I'm going full pet, though, I'm going to go for some combination of the ones up here, whether it be Korvac, whether that be the Tree of Life, whether that be Ishtak the Spring Maiden, or Light of Empyrean. A lot of these have different little goals, but they all roughly do the same. Korvac does the most increased damage. The Tree of Life is all about healing extensively. And then we have the protection and the increased stats of the Spring Maiden. Mostly this is increased stats. And then we have the actual increased resistances from the Light of Empyrean, along with some mild damage buffs. But this is mostly resistance changes. And then the Light of Empyrean doing pretty similar effects. So for full Master of Death build of a Ritualist, those are generally the broad devotions that I would go for, and ones you should absolutely be looking to try and get on your good side, particularly anything that is, of course, going to increase your damage types. So we do have that. Now that we've laid down the basic groundwork, let's talk really quickly about some common equipment that's just really effective. We have, of course, the Tinker's Ingenuity. There is a weaker version of this for, I think, level 65. But this one is actually really worthwhile because it is level 94, of course, so it's endgame. Tinker's Ingenuity, which activates whenever you go below 40% of your health, just increases your damage and your health regeneration, which is extremely nice. It increases your maximum poison and acid resistance, as well as your maximum bleeding resistance, which is really nice. And overall, just an excellent item. I do tend to use this in the Crucible. But we also have the really great pants, and what's really great about them is not the stats, but the Shimmering Splendor, which happens 100% of the time when you're hit, and you obviously confuse the target for 5 seconds, and then each time they hit you, they refresh that. So that's extremely nice. We have the Arcane Harmony Leggings. Now, I tend to lean a bit more on these when I'm running Stormcallers, because there is that elemental damage element down there in the Elemental Blast. But it's not really a big deal either way. Just a very nice pair of pants that increases your damage, gives you some decent resistances. The Fitten Mask, which is basically just a stopgap until you can find a specific helmet for you. And the Judicator's seals, which just, I mean, the set bonuses here don't look like they're too insane, but the plus 8% attack speed can really help savagery builds. And we also have the 8 to 12% reduced targets resistances, all resistances, for 2 seconds, which is just really extremely nice. Also, the health regeneration isn't that bad either. The Peerless Eye of Baranath, this is again a stopgap kind of artifact until you can amulet until you can find something else. The Conduit of Wild Whispers. Now this is something rather specific to shamans, but you can use this for pretty much any shaman, whatever. Mogdragon's Pact is always a good thing to have, regardless of whether you're playing solo, with pets, or with friends. Mogdragon's Pact can really help keep you alive, and plus one to all the other skills in Shaman are a really nice benefit. Also, peak the plus 3% max all resistances. So that's also really nice there. Then we have the Conduit of Undying. This is the the Necromancer version of the Conduit of the Wild Whispers. There's a conduit for every mastery. Same rough idea, really, except Spectral Binding, which personally, at least in terms of improvisation, I do prefer the Conduit of Undying, which is because I prefer Spectral Binding over Mogdragon's Pact a lot of the time. That's probably just me, but... Then we have the Mythical Bramblewood Amulet. Again, this is sort of a stopgap amulet. Mark of Torment is increased by 3, and all skills of the Shaman are increased by 3. Now, what is Mark of Torment? Because I did not talk about that extensively. Well, Mark of Torment is this. You are basically, for the next... However, I think it's up to 5 seconds, isn't it? Yeah. For the next 5 seconds, you are reflecting a large quantity of the damage you're taking, half of it specifically, and just reflecting that back, which is fairly impressive. Never a bad skill to have. Again, this is one of those skills that no matter what you're building, or how you're building, this can be useful to you. I just don't necessarily find it quite a must-consider like Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath and Devouring Swarm were. So, let me see. Kaysan's Eldritch Eye. This is... Now, there's 2 of these, by the way. This one increases your damage and health. This one decreases your stun, freeze, and petrify durations. Professor, which one do I use, I hear you ask? Well, that depends. If you're playing solo, I would lean a little bit more towards Kaysan's Eye, especially if you're playing hardcore. This is incredibly useful there for that reason, but there are better ways of getting these stats anyways. So take that with a grain of salt, but it's worth at least considering, just for a brief moment there, for the +1 to items. And then finally we have Serenity, which is just a relic that increases your resistances to Aether and Chaos, +1 to all skills. It heals you. It's just basically a sort of, I don't know what other relics I either have, or what other relics I can acquire, but, you know, this is just broadly useful across the way. Now, let's talk about some specific builds, right? Let's talk about first the Dreadwalker set, alright? Now this consists of 4 pieces: the cowl or the helmet, the raiment, which is the chest piece, the carver, which is the single hand melee weapon, and the tome, which is the offhand. Now it is important to note first off that we will clearly be using the Harbinger of Souls. That is a vitality and aether damage increase. The health is really nice. The aether damage being converted to vitality damage is overall a good thing, especially if you remember Ratosh. Then we have Deathwalker's Grace, which restores your health and boosts your damage, and makes your aether damage converted even at a higher rate. So let's look at the individual items for a brief moment. We have the Dreadwalker Carver. Increased vitality damage, converting that aether damage. You can see the trend here. Dread Essence, Spectral Wrath, that's fine. We have the Dreadwalker Cowl, much of the same thing. No real surprises there. Pretty standard stuff. Notice also that the complete set provides the Dreadwalker's Grace, which basically is... I'm not sure. It's basically like coughing on someone to drain their life like we do in the modern day. you know, a lot of this is fairly basic stuff, but let's take a look at the skills that this particular class increases, which are these. These are specifically the skills that are targeted by this build very specifically. Drain Essence, Spectral Wrath, Mark of Torment, Hungering Reach, Decomposition, and Spectral Binding. So we have these all here, right? But now, what else can we do? What other skills could we theoretically employ? And again, the improv portion can really help you fill in the gaps that you want, but let's look at some exciting equipment first. So the first piece of equipment I want to talk about is the Uruburuk's Reaping, which is the Necromancer relic. Obviously, this is the level 91 melee weapon. Again, this is something I usually play the Ritualist with, so that's not really a huge problem. But Uruburuk's Reaping, obviously, is boosting your Necromancer skills, boosting your Vitality and Aether damage. It's just a fairly standard run-of-the-mill relic to boost a specific class. Nothing really to speak of here, but obviously you can see how you would want this, especially with the Constellations as they are. The Flesh Eater leg wraps are an interesting point here. Now, this is increasing Hungering Reach, which we're already increasing, but it's also increasing Wendigo Totem. Now, is that a bad thing? No, that is not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination, right? Because it is very easy for us to incorporate some Wendigo Totem in here. Ta-da. And you still have 50 points left over despite having put all these points in here. So you still have some leeway as well. Now, what else is going on here? Nothing particular. We've got some nice damage conversion. This is the kind of employee that you want to... The kind of employee? What? I was about to ramble for a second there. This is overall going to give you a bit more options, especially with the bleeding damage. It will allow you to splash in Primal Strike for some additional lightning damage. Keep in mind that most, if not all, of your Aether damage is being converted into Vitality damage, so you do need a response to Chthonics, and Lightning is a great way of doing that. So if you really wanted to splash in Primal Strike and boost the bleeding damage specifically, which also, if you wanted to go into Devouring Swarm for even more Vitality resistance drop, you also have that option as well to boost Primal Strike's damage via its bleeding. So that's extremely helpful there. There's the pants. It's also worth considering Musliaux Pauldrons. Again, we're talking about Devouring Swarm and Drain Essence, which we could go into Drain Essence. We already have Drain Essence, so we're already boosting that. Again, we can go into Devouring Swarm very easily. We can go into Wendigo Totem very easily with these pieces. So now, currently, if we were to just go on ahead and go into the equipment, well, actually, that would take way too long to do. But now we still have these spare points. We have a melee weapon, we have an offhand, we have a helmet, we have a torso piece, we have a relic, we have pants, and we have shoulders. And for foot pads, Drain Essence, Wendigo Totem, we already were increasing these via the leg wraps and the pauldrons, so this is more of the same. We also have the addition of Drain Soul, which allows us to convert, of course, some attack damage from this. It's not a whole lot, I'll give you that, but you are, of course, you are equipped with all of these items and such that increase Vitality and Aether damage, so it will heal you more than it looks like it would normally, right? So you do have that as well. But now we have shoes as well. You could also go into this amulet. Now, I don't usually go into this amulet because I'm not usually doing cold damage. But if you do decide to go into this, you do have the very interesting concept of converting your Aether damage from your Drain Essence into cold damage. Now, what is that going to do for us? Well, considering that the Aether damage is being converted into Vitality damage, and again, assuming that you need a response to Chthonics, who resist Vitality pretty well, and yes, you have a lot of Vitality resistance built into your kit anyways, but maybe you want that little extra push. Well, now you've got Grave Chill, which helps a lot with that, and also allows the... Oops. the Mythical Vigorous Hunger to really increase that damage output there. Quite potentially potent. Also notice that it increases the drain and the damage of Drain Essence, which is always really nice, and you have another Legion Nova on you, which is just excellent. Furthermore, if you did decide to go with Primal Strike, the physical damage being converted to Vitality damage does really help. I keep going back there, and you still, even after all this, could very easily go into Primal Strike and Torment, and then just use your spare points for Storm Surge if you wanted, and you actually have some ways of helping that increase its damage in that way. And then the final piece of equipment I really want to talk about, but I don't often use here either, again, is the Mythical Heretics Sigil. And that's because in case you wanted to go into something maybe other than Primal Strike, maybe you want the extra damage of Ravenous Earth, well, you can do that with the Mythical Heretics Sigil. But again, not really something that I extensively go into. There are other pieces of equipment out there. I'm not covering all of the pieces of equipment, obviously. I am covering the ones that I am very fond of putting together with these sets. So with that being said, let's move on to the next set. We'll just close this out. We can actually close this out. No, we'll leave that up. Then we have Mogdragon's Peace, which is a theoretically pure... On the surface, this is a pure pet build, but while the set itself is focused on pets, you don't necessarily have to be, especially as the set increases Primal Bond. It also increases the Briarthorn and literally nothing else. So you have a lot of free points to play with if you really want to. And of course, the Mogdragon's Tranquility, and this is fairly important, gives you Aether resistance. It increases your maximum Aether resistance. Why is this important? This is important because this means that this set is abnormally effective at farming Malmoth, as well as Port Valbury. So if you are looking for a build that you can farm those areas with at the end of the game, this is a great set. Also Anasteria, but your pets tend to die to her AoE, so it's a little tough to kill her with this. It just kind of becomes a slugging match that nobody wants in their life. So Anasteria theoretically, but I would just recommend not. It's just very ugly. It gets very ugly very quickly. So of course we have, you know, all the usual things here. We've got some nice pet bonuses. We've got some excellent pet bonuses, right? We've got all of this. It's all excellent. Okay. So we have that. We have some... That's basically it. But let's talk about some very specific pieces of equipment. Mogdragon's Ardor, which of course is for the pets, right? You boost the pets up. Now there is a relic that provides you with a pet I will be talking about as well. It summons a Manticore thing. I generally don't use this because I'm more focused on trying to keep my pets alive from the AoE than have more pets. And Mogdragon's Ardor increases all your skills by +1. The one that summons the little guy there, the Manticore thing, does not do that, so... then we go right into the Mythical Overlord's Iron Grip. Now, this is fantastic because obviously we're getting more physical resistance to Primal Bond, which is really nice. You have Will of the Crypt, so we can go back here. We can talk about good old Will of the Crypt. There it is. Will of the Crypt. I forgot where it was for a second there. And then we get all these nice skeletons, which is fairly significant because not only are we increasing them to our various pet increases, but the melee ones will benefit from Emboldening Presence, as well as yourself, of course, because you have the Blessed Cleaver of Mogdragon, right? So, this is just fantastic. I also am rather fond of the Elite Coven Life Binder Mantle. Now, this is more of a stopgap in case you don't have any other better shoulder guards, but it does increase Primal Bond. It boosts your pets. It allows you to boost the Blight Fiend. Thank you. I was going to call it the Primal Fiend, but I knew that was wrong. So, very easy to just slap some points into the full here, or just down into the Unstable Anomaly if you really wanted to. But you can just go all the way into Blight Burst there. Delicious. This is a fairly effective, like I said, stopgap. Even if you never replace this, it's still a good piece of equipment for this set. Then we have the Death Grips here. Now, I don't really use these quite as often, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First off, they it increases Conjure Primal Spirit, and Primal Spirit is the only one of your pets, besides the Wraith, that isn't permanent, okay? I really dislike that personally. But if you were to use the Death Grips instead of the Overlord's Iron Grips, you would instead be approaching this a little differently. Now, we're looking at this by piece basis, but that increases cold damage, correct? Consider. I should probably be axing some of these while we're going through these and talking about them. But we have increase in cold and vitality damage. And of course we have the Primal Spirit and the Skeletons. So, cold and vitality damage, that screams Bone Harvest all the way. We go all the way up to Dread. We go all the way up to Soul Harvest as for the pet boost there. We grab Primal Spirit, and we're having a magical time, right? So there is a lot of utility here. We also get, of course, up to 3 temporary bound spirits, which also do more. This is one of the few items that is not necessarily fully all the way to level 90, but it is a point of interest here that I wanted to talk about here, especially with the raised spirit. So it really becomes an interesting question of whether or not you actually want that, but it can be useful. Now, the Mythical Deathride Handguards, we have Undead Legion, we have Ground Slam. You can actually go back in here. I'm going to pull out the Primal Spirit here. I'm going to pull out the Soul Harvest, which you'll notice a lot of similarities here between the two gloves. You'll notice the previous one did the Will of the Crypt, and the Will of the Crypt just increases the amount of damage that your skeletons are doing. This is increasing Undead Legion, which increases the number of skeletons that you have, as well as how much they cost and how long it takes to recharge. So with enough increases to Undead Legion, you can theoretically get a 6 summon limit here. But there is that. So again, between the two of them, the Deathride Handguards increase the amount of skeletons you have. The other gloves increase the damage that they do. So that's more of a personal preference thing, whichever one of these gloves that you want. They're both very useful. The Mythical Acolytes Cord, Primal Bond, Raised Skeletons. This is really... There's not really much reason to not go for this. I mean, yes, it is level 82, but it does have some excellent bonuses for pets very specifically. And there's not really any other belts that do anything with pets either. I think there's actually none, unless you go into one of the belts that just increases all Shaman / Necromancer skill points by 1. Zentrin's Mantle. Again, I don't really use this a whole lot because I'm really averse to the Primal Spirit. I think it's not quite as useful as other pets are. But again, that's just a Blight Fiend here. And the Primal Spirit here. But you'll notice that a lot of these are really reflective of the raised skeletons. A lot of them interact with that. This is more of likely one of the 2 shoulder guards that I'm likely to use here, between the 2 we just discussed. Again, we have Primal Bond increased. Blight Fiend is always a good thing. Never hate a good Blight Fiend. So there is that as well. Basically anything that increases Primal Bond. Now, I know somebody's going to mention this, that I left out certain pieces of equipment that boost pets for Ritualists. The reason why I left those out is because they increase Master of Death, and I'm going to be talking about them in another set. When you have Primal Bond being so heavily increased by your armor set, it's a waste to go into Master of Death. That's just the way I see it. Notice here we have an increase to Emboldening Presence and Call of the Grave. Boom. Increase your skeletons, increase your Briarthorn, absolutely huge amounts of poison retaliation, increased even further, 20% chance of doubling that. It's really interesting. Bonus attack speed as well is always nice, just increased health. This is an incredibly good pair of pants for this build. You really don't need to put in any more points to take advantage of that. Then we have the Fiend Flesh Greaves, which has the really interesting benefit, and this is something I will more likely build in the Crucible for this reason, but just half the time you're getting a 10,000 damage absorption shield for 20 seconds, which isn't bad. It is definitely something that can also help you in hardcore. Again, this is a slightly lower level pair of shoes, but it does carry its weight well here. We have Heart of the Wild, and we have Blight Burst. Heart of the Wild, of course, being specifically the Heart of the Wild here, but you would need to go into Magdragon's Pact. But if you're melee, then you can boost your Briarthorn, you can boost your Skeletons, you can boost your Blight Fiend. So this actually can work out really heavily in your favor if you're building the Magdragon's Pact. That's potentially quite potent there, at least in the early to mid game. In Ultimate, it's a little less noticeable, but it still makes a small difference. Then we have the Mythical Marrow Band. This just increases your Briarthorn and your Skeletons again, and also gives you random Stalwart Guardians, which is just really nice to see, especially with the Taunting Roar and just reducing the enemy damage and the taunt, which is really nice. If you are a ranged user of, well, no, you wouldn't be a ranged user, never mind. But you do have that backup just in case, because of course you are using a two-handed weapon, you don't really have the ability to shield yourself. Then we have the Mythical Crimson Briar Band, Will of the Crypt again, boosting your Skeletons. We have a lot of bleeding damage here, which is really nice with Primal Bond specifically, because again, that's going to be increasing bleeding damage, so that just layers on over. This is one of my favorite rings to build with this set, actually. I play this set with the Crimson Briar Band a lot. It's delicious, for just the reasons stated before. A fantastic ring for this. Then we have, of course, the Mythical Ugol's Ichor, or Ichor. This is something that I will not necessarily build with this specific combination. This is a ring I'm more likely to use with Occultist and either Necromancer or Shaman. It's not really something I use with the Ritualist specifically, unless for some reason I'm going with a hybrid pet self-build with a focus on the Ravenous Earth, in which case this becomes an extremely good ring. But that's a little bit specific and kind of weird. This also does have the interesting benefit of being very good for the Primal Spirit as well, because that's poison acid damage is increasing there, and the Primal Spirit does hold tail strike poison damage. So it might be worth considering this a little bit more if you really want to use the Primal Spirit. Then we have the Mythical Spirit Binder Glyph, which is another ring. Again, we have Conjure Primal Spirit, we have Magdragon's Pact, we have Reap Spirit. Now, this is also something else that I don't necessarily use a whole lot, and it's not for the reasons you think. The Mythical Spirit Binder Glyph, although it does increase a lot of these pet items, this is something I'm more likely to use on a full pet build, in all honesty, with the Master of Death, because using it with the Primal Bond is very expensive point-wise, because you have to get at least up to the point at which you're utilizing Reap Spirit, which is the full point here of levels. So that's 10 skill points away for an admittedly strong skill, but is it really worth all of that effort? I mean, of actually getting to putting the 10 points in and spending the points on the Reap Spirit. Then we have the Death Watcher Pendant, again called the Grave, which is just really nice. Now, what's fairly interesting about Call of the Grave is that this is boosting its duration. Now, keep in mind that it just by default is always going to last 10 seconds, so the fact that this is boosting that by an additional 5 seconds is a 50% increase in its duration, and it heals you. And you get an additional 10% health from Magdragon's Pact, which is itself already increasing the health through this point here. So it's plus 40% health, which is very impressive. So that's really nice as well. Excellent little amulet here to have if you're going either full or part pet focus. And then finally, we have, well, not finally, because we've got a couple of other things. We have the Wendigo Gaze. This just gets you extra skeletons, makes your Briarthorn attack faster, increases the numbers again, and the emboldening presence. This is a metal, so it doesn't clash with anything else we've been talking about, which is just really nice. Increases pets, of course. This is a blast. I love this. Just having more skeletons is really nice. Skeletons out the wazoo, and they're all doing more damage because of the emboldening presence from the Briarthorn. It's quite awesome. No, we wanted to eliminate this. We also have the Bismillah Mark of Manipulation. Now, I don't use this quite as often as the previous one because I like the extra skeleton, I like the attack speed. You know, the extra spooky boys is always a really nice time, but if you don't have that, you can actually straight up purchase this just from the Cult of Bismillah when you're a high enough reputation with them. So this is definitely, out of everything we've talked about so far, the easiest thing to get. Just purchase it, slap it on, you're pretty much all set. And it's definitely easier to get than the other amulet, where you have to hunt down a specific enemy, and I really don't like hunting down specific enemies personally, because they still might not drop what you're looking for. It's for me a little bit better to farm randomly. And then finally, for this particular set, we will be talking about the Mythical Mark of Bloody Ends. Now, this one is one of my favorite medals to put on. Besides the skeleton one, I'll put either this one on or the skeleton one, and the reason why I really like this one as well is that it gives the Blight Fiend bleeding damage, which of course we're already trying to reduce, so that's just a really big bonus. It does increase Reap Spirit, so if you're so inclined you can also grab that. You don't necessarily have to. I don't always do when I build the Mythical Mark of Bloody Ends. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but yeah, that is the Mogdragon's Piece, and a whole bunch of equipment that can really be useful for that. And then the final set is the Ultos' Storm that we will be discussing in part 1 here, which this is the most comprehensive. This is a little bit harder to farm because there's actually 5 pieces to this. Again, a two-handed weapon melee, which is fine. This is just a lot of lightning damage, +2 to all skills. In Shaman, lightning damage, just huge increases in stats. Storm Touched, Primal Strike, Storm Surge, Torment. Notice also that a certain amount of your physical damage is being converted to lightning damage. I just wanted you to notice that very specifically. But let's look at the build here. It is just straight up savagery. It is Primal Strike. It is Stormcaller's Pact. Now, I typically also build a Brute Force, but we will talk a bit more in depth with that. You'll notice that there are fewer items here just specifically for this, but we do have Massacre, which specifically increases physical bleeding and internal trauma damage, as well as, well, I already said it increases bleeding damage. And the Blood Spine is just little bits of extra damage, just some ranged damage, but, you know, that's whatever. But that's quite the, also you get to convert a bit of your attack damage to health, a little bit more anyways, which is always a bit of a relief. And then we have the good old Gladiator's Distinction. Now, this specifically is increasing Feral Hunger and Reaping Strike. Now, this is fairly key, because one of my favorite ways of running this, and I will almost always run this belt if I have it available when I am building this set, but run a full length here, pull this back here, right? And then you go into Reaping Strike, and you go into Necrotic Edge, and then you have just these spare points to do whatever with, but you can absolutely do that. It is very potent, and of course you have increased offensive ability and armor with the granted skill by this, two-handed melee, which we already have in the set, so it's not really a problem. Maximum bleeding resistance. It's a great belt. The Mythical Astral Leg Wraps, pretty similar thing. This is mostly about the lightning damage. Now, this does offer a very interesting opportunity here, where instead of going through the whole rigmarole of getting stuff from anywhere else, we can actually specifically get Lightning and Aether in there, and get Spectral Wrath and Primal Strike, which we already have anyways. Spectral Wrath, though, will give us physical protection reductions and diversify our damage output a little bit more, which, obviously, lightning, purely... I mean, the nice thing about Primal Strike is that it's bleeding physical and lightning, so it's not just lightning, which is really important, and it's not just physical. There is some extra damage on the side of bleeding, so you don't really need to worry too much about necessarily ethereals, which is really important. But you do have that as well, and of course, Spectral Wrath will decrease the Aether resistance, which is really nice as well. And finally, we have the Bone Shatter Treads. Now, this isn't something I'll necessarily always go for. It does increase Devouring Swarm, How you feel about that in the context specifically of this build is entirely up to you. Some people go for it, some people don't. Beyond that, we have Reaping Strike, of course, that makes a return. But that's... we also have Shattering Force, I almost forgot to mention this. This isn't a huge deal. It's more of a nice to have when it happens. But yeah, this was part 1 of a very comprehensive examination. Actually, hold on. I forgot to talk about the constellations for each of these. I will have to come back to that. But let's at least talk about the constellations for the Ultos set here. I will talk about the other... Actually, I have an idea here we can actually revive these with. No, that will take too long. I'll talk about them in the next episode, but for the Ultos set, we're actually only really going for Ultos as our end constellation here, and the primary reason why is because this is almost entirely focused on lightning damage, and all of the lightning damage we're doing through Shaman is also connected to physical and bleeding. So we obviously will want Ultos. We get the reduced elemental resistances, that's fine. Then you also will want to work your way towards the Huntress. Get yourself Rend, which reduces enemy bleeding resistance, which is fantastic. The way you mostly get around to here is I usually will start with purple, go into the Falcon, complete the Falcon to get the green and the purple, and then from there go into the Fox, because the Fox increases bleeding damage. Normally I'd go into the Spider, but we're already doing bleeding damage, so that's really what we go for. Now this is 5, this is 3, right? And then once we get the Huntress eventually we'll have 9, so we'll not really worry about that. We leave the green in here. But we also need red for Ultos, so the way I usually go for red, especially since we also need blue for Ultos, so we start up some red, we get into the Viper, and then we get into the Tsunami for pretty much most of the blue we need. Also the Widow as well. I mean, we could potentially run Spectral Wrath as well if we chose to. So the Arcane Bomb actually could be very useful beyond just lightning resistance. We actually have the opportunity to do some decent Aether damage, so Arcane Bomb is actually a really nice thing to have, and that puts us in the blue. Get out of there. Puts us in the blue for Ultos, and then once we have the blue for Ultos, we just need some purple. I'll usually go into the Hammer just because it's got increases to physical and internal trauma damage, which of course we are also doing, and that'll put us into the Huntress, which we get our final green, we just need the final green. Go ahead and increase Ultos, and then I go into Assassin's Mark here just for the 32% decrease in physical resistance from the enemy, and there's a reason this is important. Like I said before, enemies do typically have the good old 15% default physical resistance, but yeah, it's very important for physical attacks to go with the Assassin's Mark a lot of the times. So yeah, that is going to be part 1 here. Part 2, I will be talking about the constellations of the other 2 sets that I forgot to mention. I do apologize, but I will mention those. You will see this part 2 Monday, and I will talk about the other 5 sets in that part 2 as well. So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. Part 2 will be released Monday, and if you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, please leave them down in the comments, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. But do keep in mind that I have to release part 2, so I haven't talked about everything necessarily with the Ritualist that I want to yet. So if you're going to ask me about a specific item, at least please wait until part 2. I may or may not bring up the item. If I don't, it's either because it wasn't necessarily something that works with the set. As an example, the Fiend Binder Hood increases chaos damage, which you really don't have access to in this class of the Ritualist, and frankly, you don't need to. I normally advocate broadening your damage, but for most of the Ritualist builds that I've talked about here, you may have noticed that I didn't. The only exception was really the Ultos one, because Vitality and Aether, as I said before, really don't need to worry about that. It's already a good enough combination of damage types that you really don't need to worry too much about that. Same thing with Lightning and Bleeding. So with that being said, thank you all very much, and have a great 24 hours.